Imagine this. The year is 1347. A bell tolls in the distance. A doctor in long robes and a pointed hood walks through the dim streets, carrying a small bag filled with herbs, charms, and strange powders. His job? To keep death at bay. But what he carried was as mysterious as the diseases themselves. This is not the history of kings or battles. This is the history of fevers, plagues, and prayers. The quiet history of the men who stood at the bedside, scribbling notes by candlelight, muttering remedies, and measuring hope against despair. Tonight, we step into the daily world of medieval doctors, a world where superstition mixed with science, where astrology guided medicine, and where treatments could heal or harm. This is not just sleepy history. This is the history of life, death, and the strange rituals in between. And as you drift deeper, let the candlelight guide you into the world of medicine as it was long ago.
The doctor awoke before dawn, not to the chirping of birds, but to the toll of the church bell. In every medieval town, life began with sound, the clanging iron echoing through narrow streets. He lit a candle, its flame fighting against the heavy shadows of his chamber. His tools lay scattered, small knives, wooden boxes of herbs, parchments filled with notes written in cramped Latin. A basin of water, cold, never truly clean, stood ready for washing. Before he stepped into the streets, he whispered a prayer. For in the Middle Ages, medicine was not only knowledge, it was faith. The health of the body was bound to the health of the soul. And so the doctor began his day not with medicine, but with devotion. Outside, the town was waking. Merchants opened their stalls, farmers brought baskets of grain. But at the door of the doctor's home, a small crowd often gathered. A mother with a feverish child, an old man with aching joints, a servant carrying a bucket of foul-smelling urine, hoping the doctor might read its secrets. The practice of diagnosis was not as we imagine it today. To the medieval doctor, the body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Too much of one, too little of another, this imbalance was thought to create sickness. So he studied the urine. He held it against the morning light, sniffed its odor, compared its color to charts painted in his books. He touched the child's forehead, murmured questions, and scribbled notes in careful script. It was not science as we know it today. It was observation mixed with tradition, guesswork mixed with ritual. And yet, to the people waiting at his door, it was hope. When the morning patients had gone, the doctor turned to another source of knowledge, the heavens. On a wooden desk lay a map of the stars. Medieval medicine believed the human body was tied to the cosmos. The moon could affect the blood, Saturn could deepen melancholy, Mars could spark fevers. Before prescribing a treatment, he studied the position of the planets. Was the moon in a hot sign or a cold one? Was the patient's birth date aligned with favorable stars? A simple nosebleed could be linked to Mars. A swelling in the stomach might be tied to the movement of Jupiter. To the medieval doctor, the sky was a second anatomy, one as important as the body itself. In the back of his home stood a room heavy with smells: dried rosemary, crushed garlic, vinegar, honey, ashes of burnt toads. Here he prepared remedies. Sometimes it was as simple as boiling herbs into a bitter drink. Other times it meant grinding gems into powder, mixing wine with spices, or distilling strange concoctions through copper pipes. There was always a tension in this work, for a remedy could heal or poison. A single misstep in measurement could tip the scales from life to death. The doctor worked carefully, slowly, his sleeves rolled high. He ground powders with a mortar and pestle. He tied bundles of herbs with string. He heated mixtures over small flames. Each potion was both medicine and mystery, and the doctor, half scientist, half alchemist, moved through the smoke and steam like a figure caught between two worlds. By midday, the doctor left his home and traveled to see patients too sick to walk. He crossed muddy streets, passed churchyards, and entered houses where the air was thick with sickness. A child coughing blood, a mother groaning with childbirth, an old man whose breath rattled like broken glass. At each bedside, the doctor listened. He touched skin. He whispered reassurance. But treatment was often harsh, bleeding a patient to balance the humors, placing leeches on swollen limbs, cupping hot glass to draw out unseen vapors. Sometimes he gave words more than remedies. Sometimes all he offered was presence, a calm figure in a world that did not understand disease. To the family, the doctor's arrival brought dignity. Even if the illness could not be cured, it could be witnessed. Always in the back of the doctor's mind was the memory of plague. The Black Death had scarred Europe. Entire villages erased. Streets filled with carts carrying the dead. Doctors themselves falling ill, their remedies powerless against the invisible enemy. Even in calmer years, fear lingered. A cough might be nothing, or it might be everything. So as the doctor leaned over patients, he sometimes wore a long robe, gloves, a beak-shaped mask filled with herbs to ward off bad air. It looked like a costume, almost theatrical, but to him it was armor, a thin shield against death. And though the plague might not be present that day, its shadow followed every step he took. When the sun lowered, the doctor returned home, but his work did not end. Nobles sometimes sent messengers requesting private visits. Wealthy patients demanded mixtures of rare spices, exotic powders brought from distant lands, cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from India, sugar from Arabia. The doctor wrote letters, consulted heavy books, and compared cases from past years. His candle burned late, dripping wax on parchment. And when exhaustion came, he finally rested. Not in luxury, but in the knowledge that tomorrow would begin the same. The bell tolling, the crowd gathering, the endless search for balance between life and death. At last, the town grew quiet. Only the creak of shutters and the shuffle of rats in the street remained. The doctor sat alone by the fire. His tools were put away, his bag of remedies closed. For a brief moment, the burden of sickness left his shoulders. Yet he knew, as all medieval doctors did, that illness never truly slept. It waited, in the shadows, in the air, in the water, in the blood. And so he closed his eyes, whispering one final prayer, not for riches, not for glory, but for mercy in a world where every dawn brought sickness back to his door.
Long before the doctor saw his patients, his mind was shaped by the heavy weight of old books. Not books as we know them today, but great tomes, bound in leather, copied by monks in the dim light of monasteries. These texts were filled with Latin words, difficult, cryptic, tangled in centuries of translation. Hippocrates, Galen, Avicenna, voices from Greece, Rome, and Arabia. To the medieval doctor, these men were giants. Their words were law. To challenge them was dangerous. And so many doctors spent their lives not discovering new truths, but repeating old ones. Still, in those pages, a strange mixture of wisdom and error lived side by side. There were remedies that worked, and there were cures that were little more than superstition. For the doctor, every day began with the same question. Which words in these books were truth, and which were shadows? Not every doctor was born into wealth, but those who studied in universities became part of a rare and privileged world. In Bologna, Paris, Oxford, the halls of learning echoed with lectures. Professors in long robes read aloud from ancient texts. Students sat in silence, scratching notes on wax tablets, their breath fogging in the cold air. Medicine was taught as a philosophy. The body was a system of balance. The soul was tied to health.
Every illness was both natural and spiritual. Dissection was rare, often forbidden. A human body was sacred, not a specimen. So instead of studying the flesh itself, young doctors memorized words. They painted diagrams of veins and bones, copied endlessly from books that were already hundreds of years old. It was a strange kind of education, brilliant in its ambition, limited in its vision. And yet, it created the doctors who carried medicine through the long centuries of the Middle Ages. When a patient came, the doctor did not have stethoscopes, thermometers, or microscopes. Instead, he used his senses. Sight. He studied the color of skin, the shape of the tongue, the yellow of the eyes. Touch. He felt for warmth, for swelling, for a pulse that beat too quickly. Smell. He leaned close to the patient's breath, to the urine, to the sweat. Taste. In rare cases, he touched medicine to his tongue, or even tasted a drop of the patient's fluids, believing it revealed secrets. It was a world where the body spoke in signs, and the doctor's role was not to test with machines, but to interpret those signs like a priest reads omens. Behind many doctors' homes, or in the courtyards of monasteries, grew the secret allies of medicine. Herbs. Sage for strength, rosemary for memory, poppy for pain, garlic to cleanse the blood, honey to soothe wounds. Every leaf had meaning. Every root carried power. But the garden was also a place of danger, for alongside healing plants grew those that killed. Hemlock, belladonna, foxglove. The medieval doctor knew their shapes, their colors, their seasons. He bent to the soil, pulling weeds, cutting stems, storing leaves in jars. In those gardens, medicine was alive. It grew with the sun, it slept with the frost. And the doctor, in tending the plants, touched something older than books, older than faith. The earth itself. Some doctors were also alchemists. In hidden rooms, they lit fires under flasks of bubbling liquid. They ground metals into dust, distilled vapors through twisting glass tubes. Their goal was not only to heal. Some sought the philosopher's stone, a mythical substance said to turn lead into gold and grant eternal life. But along the way, alchemists discovered useful tools, stronger alcohols, purified salts, new ways of mixing and preserving medicines. The line between doctor and magician was thin. To the sick, it mattered little. What mattered was whether the potion worked. And so, many patients accepted remedies brewed in smoky rooms, never knowing whether they drank science or sorcery. Above all knowledge, above all remedies, stood the church. Priests preached that illness was punishment for sin. Healing could not come without confession. Hospitals were often run by monasteries, where care meant prayer as much as medicine. Doctors had to walk carefully. Too much curiosity risked accusations of pride. Too much experiment risked whispers of heresy. Yet, the church also preserved knowledge. Monks copied texts, kept libraries safe, and opened their doors to the poor. The doctor could not exist without the church, but neither could he move entirely free under its gaze. It was a balance as delicate as the humors themselves. For the wealthy, medicine was more than survival. It was prestige. Noble families displayed their doctors as symbols of wisdom and refinement. A personal physician meant one's household was guarded not only by swords, but by knowledge. Doctors often wore fine robes. They spoke Latin. They carried themselves with the dignity of scholars. To the poor, they seemed almost untouchable. But behind the dignity, behind the status, lay the same uncertainty. For whether rich or poor, noble or beggar, the truth was the same. The doctor could not always cure. And yet, people believed. They believed because belief itself was medicine. As the night returned, the doctor retreated to his books. The candle burned low. Shadows trembled across the walls. He opened a manuscript, traced the words with his finger, and read aloud in whispers. In that stillness, medicine was not only practice, it was memory. The memory of civilizations long gone, the memory of healers who had lived centuries before. And as the doctor closed his eyes, he knew that tomorrow he would carry those voices with him into homes, into gardens, into bedsides. A chain unbroken from past to present, from word to word.
The day of a medieval doctor began before the sun had fully risen. The world outside was often still, the streets empty, the air heavy with smoke from hearth fires. In the quiet of dawn, the doctor prepared himself, not with the quick bustle of a modern physician, but with ritual. First, he prayed. Health was not just a matter of flesh, it was a gift of God. Before touching patients, before opening books, before grinding herbs, he placed himself in the order of heaven. Then he dressed. Layered robes, sometimes bright with color, sometimes plain depending on his wealth. A cap, a hood, or a soft felt hat rested on his head. In his hand, a walking stick, not only for support, but to symbolize wisdom and learning. When the bell of the local church rang, the day of healing began. No medieval doctor traveled without his bag. Inside were the tools of his trade. Small glass vials stoppered with wax, holding powders and tinctures. A brass or wooden urine flask, round-bellied and clear, for examining color and texture. Knives, not for surgery as we know it, but for lancing boils, opening abscesses and bloodletting. Parchment pages of notes, talismans of saints, and sometimes a relic, a bone, a ribbon, a holy charm. This bag was part science, part superstition. It carried both medicine and faith. And wherever he walked, it marked him as what he was, a man between worlds, the natural and the spiritual. The doctor's day was made of visits. Homes, manors, sometimes monasteries. Inside the sick room, the air was heavy, not with disinfectant or sterile sheets, but with smoke, dampness, and the human smell of sweat. The patient lay on a straw mattress or on carved oak if wealthy. Curtains were drawn to keep out the cold. A candle burned low, filling the room with wavering shadows. The doctor would sit close, lean forward, and study the patient's face. He asked questions about appetite, about dreams, about when the illness began. He asked not only the patient, but the family, for all details mattered. Then he would order the chamber prepared, windows opened or closed, incense burned, water brought. The balance of air and scent was part of healing. Finally, he examined the urine, a ritual so central that patients often brought their flask before the doctor even arrived. Holding it to the light, he compared the color to the diagrams in his book, pale like spring water, red like wine, black like ink. The diagnosis was never quick. It was woven from sight, sound, smell, and faith. Perhaps the most iconic act of the medieval doctor was bloodletting. According to Galen, the body's health depended on the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much of one brought disease, and so, to restore balance, blood was often drawn. The doctor chose the vein with care, a small cut of the knife, the crimson thread flowing into a bowl, sometimes only a few ounces, sometimes more. It was believed to cool fevers, to clear headaches, to release the poison of plague. Yet, though often harmful, it was trusted. Patients felt relief, whether from the ritual, the faintness, or the faith that illness had been released. The sound of dripping blood into a basin was for centuries the music of medicine. Not all patients called the physician. Many turned instead to the apothecary, the medieval pharmacist.
The apothecary's shop smelled of spice and resin. Jars of powders and dried herbs lined the shelves. Mortars and pestles ground endlessly. Here, the doctor might stop to purchase rare ingredients, saffron from the East, nutmeg from the Indies, sugar carried across oceans. Medicine was global long before the word globalization existed. But the apothecary was also a rival. Patients trusted him because his medicines were tangible, visible, immediate. And so between physician and apothecary, there was both cooperation and tension. One spoke the language of books, the other the language of hands. Not all patients could pay in gold or silver. For the poor, payment might come in bread, eggs, or labor. The doctor who visited them entered homes of bare stone, where smoke curled from the hearth and animals shared the floor. Here, there were no curtains of silk, no feather beds, only straw, patched walls, and the quiet endurance of suffering. The remedies were humbler: garlic broth, poultices of herbs, whispered prayers. Yet even in poverty, belief in the doctor's presence carried weight. He was more than a healer. He was a symbol that the sick were not forgotten. After a long day, the doctor returned home, but his work did not end at the doorstep. By candlelight, he recorded his cases: patient's name, symptoms, treatment, notes in the margins, corrections, doubts, questions. These records, though fragile, built the memory of medicine. They were copied, shared, debated in universities. Some were lost in fire, war, or neglect, but others survived. A window into the daily thoughts of men who tried, with the tools of their age, to understand the mysteries of flesh and spirit. When midnight came, the world outside was still. The doctor sat alone. The flame flickered. His hands smelled of herbs, of ink, of smoke. Tomorrow there would be new patients, new mysteries. But for this moment, in the silence, he felt the strange burden of his calling. He was not simply a man of science, not simply a servant of God. He was both, and neither. A figure caught in the twilight between knowledge and faith, between earth and heaven, between cure and comfort. And in that twilight, medieval medicine lived.
A medieval doctor was never just a man of practice. He was, first and foremost, a man of books. In his study, bound in leather and chain, sat the wisdom of centuries, the works of Galen, written in distant Rome, the Canon of Medicine by Avicenna, copied and recopied in Arabic and Latin, the herbal manuals of Dioscorides, with drawings of plants still used in cures. Each page was a bridge to the past. Each margin carried the ink of countless hands, glosses, notes, translations, doubts. To be a doctor was to live in dialogue with the dead, to weigh their words against the cries of the living. But knowledge had limits. The church, fearful of desecration, often forbade human dissection. And so anatomy was studied through animals, pigs, apes, even dogs, their bodies opened in dimly lit halls. The physician pointed with his rod, reciting passages from Galen, while the barber surgeon cut. The audience, students, clerks, apprentices, strained to see through the smoke and shadows. Yet what they saw did not always match the words. Veins lay not where Galen had said. Bones curved differently. Still, the texts held authority. To challenge them was to risk more than error. It was to risk reputation, even heresy. Thus, medieval medicine was suspended between body and book, between what was read and what was seen. To heal the body, one must first consult the heavens. So believed the medieval world. The physician's desk was never without an astrolabe or zodiac chart. When a child was born, the stars were marked. When a treatment was begun, the moon's phase was studied. Bloodletting, for example, was timed with precision. To open a vein under the wrong constellation was to risk death. Even kings demanded charts for their health. The stars, after all, were thought to shape not only destiny, but digestion, fever, and fate itself. In the flicker of lamplight, the medieval doctor read the sky as carefully as he read the human pulse. In the universities, medicine was not practiced at the bedside, but argued in the hall. Scholars gathered, robes sweeping the floor, voices echoing against stone walls. They debated humors, compared texts, quoted Aristotle and Avicenna like sacred scripture. The patient, distant and unseen, was more theory than flesh. Should phlegm be cooled with mint or warmed with cinnamon? Is fever caused by excess choler or by corruption of air? The debates lasted hours, sometimes days. The air grew thick with smoke, parchment, and pride. And when the disputations ended, students carried the words away, into cities, towns, and villages where real bodies waited. But if the physician was the scholar, the barber-surgeon was the craftsman. He shaved beards, pulled teeth, set broken bones, and cut into flesh when others would not. His tools were simple: razors, saws, cautery irons heated in the fire. The smell of burned skin filled the workshop as he sealed wounds. Where the physician prescribed, the surgeon acted. And yet, the surgeon was seen as lesser, a laborer with blood on his hands rather than ink on his fingers. Still, for many patients, it was the barber-surgeon who brought real relief. A toothache pulled, a wound stitched, a limb set straight. The divide between theory and practice, between scholar and craftsman, defined medieval medicine. Not all cures came from books or blades. Some came from touch and belief. The royal touch was one of the most powerful of these. It was believed that kings, chosen by God, could cure scrofula, a disease of the lymph nodes, by laying hands upon the afflicted. Crowds gathered at courts, desperate for healing. The king touched them, gave them a token coin, and prayers were said. Many claimed recovery, some did not. But the ritual itself endured for centuries. Faith and medicine were woven so tightly together that to separate them was unthinkable. For all the authority of doctors, patients had their own wisdom. Mothers knew herbs for childbirth, old women carried charms and prayers. Travelers shared cures from distant lands. Sometimes these remedies clashed with learned medicine. Sometimes they worked when nothing else did. To the patient, the physician was one voice among many, and healing was not only what was prescribed, but what was believed, remembered, and hoped for. At the end of the day, when patients were gone and streets quieted, the medieval doctor returned again to his books. He read by candlelight, lips moving silently over Latin phrases. He compared notes, copied diagrams, sharpened his quills. The world outside lived in sickness and uncertainty. Inside his chamber, he sought order, in charts, in humors, in stars. But even he knew, the body often resisted the page. The mysteries of life and death were too vast for ink alone. Still, he studied. Still, he wrote. Because in the twilight of knowledge and faith, medicine could never sleep.
The life of a medieval doctor was always haunted by fear. Not fear of battle, nor of swords, but of sickness. Plagues rose like storms, sudden and unstoppable. In towns and villages, bells tolled not for weddings, but for burials. Doctors wrapped themselves in long coats, masks filled with herbs, charms hung discreetly from their belts. They did not understand infection as we do. They spoke instead of poisoned air, miasma, drifting invisibly through streets. They blamed corrupted humors, or the alignment of planets, or the sins of mankind. And so a physician walked among the dying with more questions than cures, a man of knowledge facing mysteries he could never master. Yet not all healing came from the physician's hand. Many sought relief on the open road. Pilgrimages became medicine for the desperate.
The sick walked to shrines of saints, carrying offerings of wax, coins, and prayers. At Canterbury, pilgrims touched the relics of Thomas Becket. In Compostela, they prayed at the tomb of St. James. The journey itself was part of the cure. The rhythm of steps, the chant of prayers, the hope of divine mercy. Some returned with health restored. Some returned with nothing but blisters. And some never returned at all. Still, in the medieval world, the pilgrimage was a prescription older than any book. Before universities, before professional guilds, the monasteries had been the true hospitals. Monks grew herbs in cloister gardens, sage for fevers, lavender for wounds, mint for digestion. They copied manuscripts, preserved ancient knowledge, and read aloud the cures of Dioscorides and Galen. The sick lay in long halls beneath crucifixes, tended with broth, prayer, and gentle care. For many poor villagers, the monastery was the only place to find a bed, a warm meal, and a healer who asked nothing in return. Though monks could not always cure, they could always comfort. And sometimes in the quiet of candlelit cloisters, comfort was as close to healing as one could hope. But medicine was also a trade. In bustling towns, apothecaries sold powders, syrups, and herbs to anyone who could pay. Their shelves held jars of dried flowers, crushed minerals, ground spices from faraway lands. Some medicines were useful, willow bark for pain, mint for the stomach. Others were strange, powdered gems, dried toads, even pieces of mummy imported from Egypt. Quacks, too, walked the markets. They promised miracle cures, shouted charms, sold bottles of colored water as elixirs. For the poor, this was the doctor they could afford. For the wealthy, it was a curiosity, another remedy to try, another gamble against death. The line between healer and merchant was thin, and in every town square, hope was for sale. Not all healers were men. In cottages, kitchens, and gardens, women carried knowledge as old as the land itself. They brewed teas for fever, poultices for wounds, charms whispered over infants in the night. Some were midwives, guiding new life into the world. Some were wise women, trusted by their neighbors more than distant physicians. But suspicion followed them. If a cure worked too well, if knowledge seemed too deep, whispers of witchcraft arose. The same hands that healed could be accused of harming. Still, in the quiet corners of medieval life, women's remedies saved countless lives. Their craft, often unrecorded, was medicine written not in books, but in memory. A doctor's bag was not only filled with herbs and syringes. It often held amulets, relics, and charms. To ward off plague, some wore crosses carved from bone. To heal fever, prayers were written on parchment and tied around the wrist. To protect against demons, herbs were burned and smoke waved across the body. The line between medicine and magic blurred. To the medieval mind, illness was not only of the flesh, but of the soul, the stars, and unseen spirits. And so even the learned doctor might whisper a prayer as he pressed a poultice, or slip a protective charm into a patient's hand, knowing that belief itself could be as powerful as any cure. The 12th and 13th centuries saw a new dawn for medicine. As trade routes expanded, so too did ideas. Arabic texts preserved in Baghdad and Cordoba flowed into Europe. Scholars translated Avicenna, Al-Razi, and others into Latin. Suddenly, medieval doctors had new eyes through which to see the body. Universities grew: Paris, Bologna, Montpellier. Medicine became a discipline, a profession, a path of prestige. But even as learning flourished, practice remained rooted in the old. Humors, astrology, relics, charms, all endured, woven into the daily life of a physician. For the medieval doctor lived not in an age of science or superstition, but in an age where both were one. And when day turned to night, The medieval physician sat by his fire, the murmurs of markets, the cries of the sick, the chants of pilgrims, still echoing in his mind. He had studied the stars. He had touched the pulse. He had weighed the humors, whispered the prayers, written the prescriptions. And yet he knew how fragile it all was, how little power he truly held against pestilence, hunger, and time. Still he carried on. For every face of sickness, there was also hope, and in the dim glow of his chamber, hope was the truest medicine he could ever give.
To the medieval doctor, the body was a balance of humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Too much of one, illness. Too little, weakness. The cure? Restore the balance. And so, bloodletting. A doctor would arrive with a brass basin etched with lines showing how much blood to take. Leeches squirmed in jars, knives glinted in firelight. A patient sat nervously as the physician tied a cord around the arm. The vein was pricked, dark blood flowing into the bowl. Sometimes the treatment brought relief. A fever cooled, a headache eased. Other times it left the patient faint, weakened, or worse. Yet for centuries, bloodletting was not only common, it was expected. A ritual of medicine where doctors and patients alike trusted the wisdom of Galen, even when the cure seemed harsher than the disease. A medieval doctor was also an astrologer, for the stars did not only guide sailors, they guided healers. Before touching a patient, a physician studied the sky. If Saturn ruled the hour, surgery was dangerous. If the moon was in the wrong sign, bloodletting was forbidden. Mars in ascension? Expect fevers and wounds. Charts were drawn, symbols inscribed. The heavens were mapped as carefully as the human body. Patients accepted this without question. To heal without consulting the stars was reckless, like traveling without a compass. And so medicine was not only of earth and flesh, but of sky and eternity. Few doctors of the Middle Ages saw the inside of the human body. Dissection was rare, forbidden in many places, whispered about in secrecy. Knowledge came from books, not from corpses. Galen's texts, written centuries earlier, still ruled the understanding of veins, organs, and bones. Errors remained unchallenged, copied again and again by scholars who dared not contradict the ancients. Yet curiosity stirred. In hidden rooms, some physicians dissected criminals' bodies, watching the secrets of flesh unfold. What they saw did not always match the texts. And though they risked censure, they wrote, observed, remembered. For in every shadowed chamber, medicine inched closer to truth. The doctor's satchel was not empty. There were scalpels, delicate and sharp, cautery irons heated red hot to burn wounds closed, needles of bone and bronze, and always herbs, dried, ground, distilled, or steeped into bitter brews. Surgery was not gentle. No anesthesia but wine, opium, or prayer. No antiseptic but smoke or salt. A broken bone might be set with wooden splints, an abscess cut open with a swift slash, a tooth pulled with iron forceps, the cry of pain swallowed by faith that suffering led to healing.
Brutal, yes, but to a medieval doctor, necessity was its own mercy. By the 13th century, hospitals spread across Europe, yet they were not places of modern medicine. They were houses of charity. Run by monks, nuns, and guilds, they offered beds to the sick, food to the hungry, and prayer to the dying. Rows of patients lay side by side beneath vaulted ceilings painted with saints and angels. Physicians visited, but rarely performed elaborate cures. The true purpose was care, rest, and the salvation of the soul. For in the medieval mind, illness was both physical and spiritual. To heal the body was one task.
to prepare the soul for eternity, the greater one. Every doctor guarded recipes: a powder of crushed pearls given to noble ladies, syrups of honey and herbs for coughs, vinegar infused with rosemary for wounds, and always theriac, a famous compound of dozens of ingredients believed to cure everything from plague to snakebite. Some remedies worked, others were hope in a jar, but patients believed, and belief itself could be medicine. The doctor's reputation grew not only from skill, but from the aura of mystery surrounding his remedies. For knowledge in the medieval world was as powerful as faith. The medieval doctor lived between two worlds, the sacred and the earthly, the miraculous and the practical. He prayed before his treatments. He weighed humors like a philosopher. He watched the stars like an astrologer. He mixed herbs like an alchemist. And sometimes he simply held a patient's hand, offering presents when no cure was possible. His life was not only one of science, but of trust. And that trust, fragile though it was, bound doctor and patient in a bond older than reason itself. When his duties ended, the doctor's home was not quiet. Scrolls lay open, ink still drying on notes. Herbs hung from rafters, filling the air with bitter fragrance. A basin, stained from bloodletting, cooled in the corner. He sat with a candle, quill in hand, copying the wisdom of ancients, adding his own small observations, knowing they too would one day be copied by another hand. For medicine was not the work of one man, nor of one life. It was a chain, stretching through centuries, each link fragile, flawed, yet carrying the weight of survival. And so, he wrote, even as the candle burned low, believing that in these words the future might heal what the present could not.
It begins with a sound, a knock, slow, deliberate. Behind the door lies fear. A family whispers, coughs, prays. They know what the knock means. Outside stands a figure, robed in black, a long, beaked mask covering his face, eyes hidden behind dark glass. The plague doctor. To some he was salvation, to others a herald of death. Where he walked, pestilence followed, and yet he came, because someone must. The beak of the mask was stuffed with herbs, rosemary, lavender, cloves, and myrrh. A filter, it was believed, to ward off the foul airs, the miasmas that carried disease. The robe, waxed and heavy, the gloves, the boots, all meant to seal the doctor from the poison of the world. He looked less like a healer and more like a phantom, a shadow moving through empty streets, a figure from nightmare, not born from imagination, but from desperation. Inside the house, silence broke with coughing. The plague doctor approached the bed. The patient lay sweating, trembling, lymph nodes swollen into blackened lumps. The family looked on in horror, clutching rosaries, their faces pale with helplessness. The doctor examined, took notes, murmured prayers, and prescribed what little he could: bleeding, poultices, thiaric, or fumigation. But all knew the cures were fragile as smoke. The Black Death did not yield easily. It consumed. When plague swept a city, life itself collapsed. Markets closed. Bell church bells tolled endlessly. Carts rolled through the streets, bearing the bodies of neighbors and kin. "Bring out your dead!" the cry echoed from dawn to dusk. Doctors walked among the ruins of normal life. Some fled, abandoning their posts. Others stayed, risking all. Their writings tell us of empty towns,
of fear so thick it stifled breath, of prayers rising louder than any cure.
The plague doctor was more than a healer. He was also a recorder. In his ledgers, he wrote names: who had fallen, who had survived, who had perished within hours. The numbers grew day by day. Entire households gone, streets emptied, villages silenced. These records became history, cold, factual, unfeeling. Yet behind every number was life, a family, a memory. The doctor carried not only his satchel of herbs, but the unbearable weight of remembrance. Science alone could not comfort the dying. And so the plague doctor prayed. He lit candles at bedside altars. He urged confession, encouraged the last rites, and joined families in hymns whispered through tears. For in those days, medicine was never far from faith. Healing was uncertain, but salvation was eternal. And often, in the shadow of plague, it was not the cure people sought most, but the presence of someone who did not abandon them. When his work was done, the doctor did not rest. He stripped off his mask, washed in vinegar, burned his clothes if they seemed tainted, and then, in candlelight, he wrote, case after case, treatments tried, failures endured, the smell of herbs still clinging to his hands. He knew the limits of his craft, but he also knew to write, to record, to remember was its own form of medicine. If not for the living, then for the future. The plague passed, as all storms eventually do, but the doctor carried it with him. The faces, the cries, the silence of streets once full of life. He was more than a physician. He was a witness, a keeper of sorrow, a bearer of stories. And though his mask, his robe, his treatments would one day vanish into museums, his burden remained. For every plague doctor, whether known or forgotten, was a reminder that even in the darkest hours, humanity sent someone to knock at the door.
The plague had passed, but the streets remembered. Cobblestone still held the faint smell of decay. Houses, once full of laughter and argument, stood empty or half collapsed. Children peered from behind shuttered windows, their eyes wary of strangers. Even the wind seemed reluctant to stir. In these quiet streets, townspeople walked carefully, speaking in hushed tones, glancing at every shadow as if disease still lingered in the air. Life had returned, technically, but it was a life tinged with fear, with memory, with absence. Where once prayers had mingled with remedies, now whispers of superstition spread like roots in cracked stone. Amulets were sewn into clothing, charms hung at doorways, holy water sprinkled on thresholds. Some believed the plague was punishment, others thought it a cleansing fire. Strange rituals emerged, processions, offerings, in talismans meant to appease unseen forces. Medicine had failed, they said, but faith and fear could still work wonders. The line between healing and protection blurred, and sometimes it vanished entirely. Doctors returned cautiously to their tables, their ledgers now crowded with the memory of death. Treatments were examined with new skepticism. Herbs and poultices persisted, but so did doubt. Guilds debated endlessly, sharing what little worked and discarding what had failed. Some physicians turned to observation, noting patterns and symptoms in the seasons, in the habits of the living and the dead. Medicine had learned a harsh lesson. Certainty was a luxury the plague did not allow. And yet this trial by fire laid the groundwork for methods that would endure. Churches filled again, but differently. The faithful arrived not just for comfort, but for understanding, for guidance,
for absolution of a world they could not control. Monks and priests began recording deaths and illnesses, blending devotion with careful observation. Confessionals carried the weight of both sin and survival. Faith had not failed, it had shifted, intertwined with the needs of a traumatized populace. Prayer was still hope, but knowledge, the careful watching of life and death, had become its companion. In town squares and cemeteries, small memorials sprouted. Simple crosses for neighbors whose names had been lost, candles for those who had vanished in the night. Families told stories of the dead, passing memories through whispered tales. The plague had taken bodies, but it could not erase memory. Communities stitched themselves together from remembrance, creating rituals of mourning that would outlast even the dead themselves. In this way, survival was not merely a physical act, but a moral one, remembering those who could no longer speak. Markets reopened slowly, though the flow of life never quite matched the rhythm before. Merchants displayed goods, children played in the streets, and work resumed, but always with caution. Laws were re-examined. Who was responsible for care? Who for burial? Who for the sick? Guilds formalized, public health became a concept in ink and parchment, and communities began to codify cleanliness and quarantine. The ordinary world, scarred and wary, rebuilt itself with care and an eye towards what had been lost. Doctors, scholars, and clergy began to see the plague as a teacher. Every record, every observation, every note of a failed treatment became part of a growing collective memory. Healing was no longer purely ritual or prayer. It demanded attention, documentation, and experimentation. Herbs were cataloged, symptoms described, deaths counted, not to conquer fate entirely, but to understand it. Fear remained, yes, but it was tempered by knowledge. Superstition was still present, but it shared the stage with reason, observation, and method. And so the world moved forward, slowly, quietly, carrying both its wounds and its wisdom. The shadow of the plague lingered in memory, in superstition, in the cautious hands of doctors and the prayers of the faithful. Society had changed. Medicine had learned humility. Faith had gained complexity. Communities had gained resilience. And through it all, life, fragile, stubborn, human, continued seeking balance between fear and hope, between the known and the unknown. In these silent, scarred streets, one could hear a new rhythm, a rhythm of careful recovery, of lives rebuilt with intention, of knowledge and belief walking side by side into a future shaped by shadow, yet illuminated by memory.
The first light crept through narrow windows, painting pale stripes on stone floors. Candles guttered in the corners, and the scent of herbs mingled with the lingering damp of the walls. Doctors rose early, not out of urgency but habit. Routines were their anchor. They checked beds, whispered to patients, adjusted bandages, and measured pulse with practiced hands. Outside, the town awoke slowly. Inside, a smaller world stirred. An ordinary world, careful and deliberate, shaped by the lessons of what had passed. In quiet chambers, doctors consulted manuscripts, their margins crowded with notes from years of observation. Parchments detailed herbs, poultices, and the pulse of the body. Diagrams of veins and organs mapped mysteries half known. Scales weighed powders, jars held dried roots, crushed bark, and fragrant blossoms. Each tool was familiar, yet fragile. Medicine remained a dance of precision and patience. Students gathered, scribes recorded, and the rhythm of learning intertwined with the rhythm of care. Patients arrived in small numbers now, their ailments ranging from coughs to lacerations, from fevers to broken bones. Doctors listened first, watched, touched lightly, and only then prescribed. Bloodletting persisted, poultices remained in use, yet observation and inquiry guided every choice. The plague had taught caution, humility, and attention to detail. A diagnosis was never merely words, it was care, attention, and the gentle holding of a life in balance. Hours passed in measured silence. Doctors watched wounds heal, fevers rise and fall, children sleep and stir. They wrote notes, compared symptoms, whispered prayers. In their calm, routine work, the memory of the plague lingered, not as terror, but as a reminder. The unseen could strike without warning, and every act of care was precious. Each patient, each day, was both lesson and prayer, both record and ritual. Young students shadowed the older physicians, learning more from observation than words. Hands were guided, questions encouraged, mistakes corrected with patience. Herbs were smelled, needles held, bandages folded. Books were opened, diagrams studied, and stories of past plagues told not to frighten, but to teach vigilance and empathy. Through this passing of knowledge, medicine gained continuity, a fragile but enduring chain connecting generations. Medicine remained entwined with faith and ritual. Candles were lit before operations, prayers whispered for the sick, herbs sprinkled according to tradition. Yet observation had found its place alongside faith. Treatments were tested, recorded, debated. The doctor's day was a balance between old beliefs and new practices, between ritual and reason, between hope and careful caution. In these routines, the ordinary became extraordinary. Small acts of care transformed into the quiet work of preservation. As sunlight waned, doctors wrote in ledgers, reflecting on the day. Who had recovered? Who had worsened? Which remedies had shown promise? Candles flickered over notes, illuminating margins filled with questions and reminders. The pace was slow, deliberate. In these reflections, they held memory close. Memory of the plague, memory of lives lost, and memory of every small recovery, every quiet survival. Night settled, and the town grew silent. Doctors washed, tended to their herbs, and prepared for another day. Their lives were ordinary yet sacred, guided by routines that preserved life and knowledge alike. The plague's shadow had receded, but its lessons endured in every measurement, every poultice, every whispered prayer. Life continued in careful rhythm, ordinary, attentive, and profoundly human. And in this continuity, medicine found its place, not as a cure-all, but as a witness, a guide, and a gentle guardian of the living. When the plague had passed, it left behind a silence that no bell, no prayer could ever fully fill. Cities rebuilt, fields regrew, markets bustled again, yet in every quiet corner, the memory lingered. Doctors carried it in their hands, in their notes, in their daily rounds. It was not only a disease, they knew now, it was a teacher of humility, of fragility, of the fragile balance between life and death. Infirmaries filled once more with coughs, wounds, childbirth pains, and fevers. Doctors returned to their routines, the careful touch of the wrist, the mixing of herbs, the steady rhythm of observation. Students bent over books, scribbling notes by candlelight. Apothecaries ground roots and bark, weighing them as if weighing time itself. The world moved again, not unchanged, but scarred, every gesture of care carrying the shadow of what had been lost. The Black Death had carved deep furrows in the soil of history. Superstition and faith had been tested. Medicine had been shaken, reshaped, and slowly rebuilt. Some remedies were abandoned, others refined, and new ideas began to take root. Small sparks of observation and reason in a world that had once leaned so heavily on ritual. From the ashes of devastation, the faint outline of modern medicine began to emerge. Doctors rose each day with a quiet weight upon them. They were no longer only healers, they were also guardians of memory. Every poultice, every incision, every whispered prayer was touched by remembrance of the plague pits, the silent streets, the years when fear itself seemed to walk among men. And yet they did not stop.
Their duty was not only to treat the body, but to keep alive the knowledge that suffering had forced upon them. The passing of knowledge became sacred. Older physicians told apprentices of the plague years, not as horror stories, but as lessons, to watch carefully, to doubt certainties, to be humble before the unseen. The ordinary rhythm of medieval medicine, of herbs, charts, and bedside whispers, was forever touched by that memory. In their daily life, the plague remained invisible, but never absent. Beyond hospitals, beyond towns, society itself shifted. Villages remembered their losses, churches reflected on shaken faith, and families carried stories of survival like heirlooms. The Black Death had not ended life, but it had shaped it, quietly, deeply, and permanently. And in every ledger, every hospital wall, every surgeon's careful hand, the echo remained.
So, as night falls, we leave behind the doctors of the Middle Ages. We leave them in their stone infirmaries, with their jars of herbs, their heavy books, and their steady, watchful eyes. They are long gone now, yet their daily lives remind us of something simple, that even in the face of the greatest terror, people continued. They rose each morning, they tended the sick, they learned, they taught, they endured. The plague was a shadow, but shadows always pass, and what remains is the fragile, ordinary, enduring rhythm of human care. So rest now. Let the echoes of their world fade into the quiet of the night. The doctors have laid down their tools, the candles burn low, and history for tonight can sleep.
Thank you for walking this path with dream-woven history, where stories never fade and memories live forever. May your night be peaceful, your dreams full of wonder, and may history whisper to you until the morning light.